Welcome, Dr. Ahn, and congratulations.
Thanks, Diane.
First, tell us, what is an XPRIZE?
So XPRIZE is a foundation that tries to put out challenges in order to push the edge of science. So there have been a number of competitions before which have been co-sponsored by a certain industry. So for instance, there was the Ansari Space Prize, which was sponsored by this person in order to fund private space travel. And in this case, this challenge was the Qualcomm Tricorder XPRIZE, and Qualcomm was the one that sponsored the prize, gave the money, and XPRIZE Foundation was the one that actually ran the competition and actually put the question out there, so put the challenge out there. So Qualcomm is the sponsoring agent, and then the XPRIZE Foundation is the one that's running this competition.
That's wonderful. And I understand that your team actually entered a specific XPRIZE competition. Can you tell us a little bit about what the challenges were for that particular competition and the requirements?
The challenge was to create a portable device that anyone at home or even in a very remote region could actually diagnose up to 15 medical conditions. And the challenge that came with that is that the device had to be portable. In fact, the challenge put out by the XPRIZE was that the requirement was the whole kit had to weigh less than 5 pounds. Wow. And then the second thing was that it had to be user-friendly. And obviously, if this device was going to serve like their personal doctor, it had to bypass or even overcome some of the complex lingo that comes with the medical field. And it had to be something that anyone could be using, even in the remote regions, and someone even without much education as well. And the third thing was the reliability and validity of this tricorder device. It had to actually give the correct answer and not give some diagnosis that may, unknowingly create anxiety or fear about what they may or may not have. So those are the big challenges that were put out by the XPRIZE Foundation.
So don't keep us in suspense. Tell us a little bit about what the device actually looks like and how I would use it.
The device is, like I mentioned before, is 5 pounds. It comes in a box, a rectangular box, and if I were the user, it would come with a smartphone. I would take the smartphone, and it would guide you through a set of questions in order to come to a potential list of diagnoses. And then it would direct you to certain tests that you would need to take in order to confirm whether you have or do not have that condition. So those 3 additional sets of the tricorder kit are the vital monitoring set, which helps to monitor 5 vital signs continuously. That includes heart rate, breathing, temperature, blood pressure, and the camera set, the scope set. And what that does is it takes a picture of the skin, for instance, to diagnose melanoma, or the tympanic ear membrane of the ear to diagnose otitis media. And it's Bluetooth enabled, so it communicates with the cell phone so that you could actually see the pictures as you're doing it. And then the third part is the breath, blood, urine test. So it helps to diagnose certain conditions which require those tests. For instance, diabetes, hepatitis A, TB was one of them at one point. Breathing was for the COPD, which is a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease like emphysema. And the urine test was for urinary tract infection. And then there were 3 sets that come with the smartphone. And those 3 sets are the vital monitoring set, the scope and camera set, and the breath, urine, and blood tests. The vital monitoring set enables you to continuously monitor a number of vital signs, including temperature, heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure. And the scope and camera set is a Bluetooth-enabled camera. It actually is high magnification and enables you to look at the skin or the tympanic membrane to diagnose, for instance, melanoma, or otitis media for the ear. And then the third part was the breath, urine, and blood test. And the blood test included tests to diagnose diabetes, TB was one of them at some point, hepatitis A was another test, and and anemia. And then the urine test was to diagnose urinary tract infection, and the breath test to diagnose COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, such as emphysema.
I'm hearing about it, and I'm thinking that, that does sound very feasible. I can imagine really being attracted to being able to interact with the device, and it does sound like clearly you met the goal of it being user-friendly. So the competition is specifically named the Tricorder.
Yes.
Can you tell us why?
The Tricorder comes from Star Trek. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan, but okay. But Dr. McCoy, who is the doctor for the original Star Trek, used a device called the Tricorder to scan whoever member of the crew in order to determine whether that person had a disease or not. And as it turns out, I believe the Qualcomm CEO at that time, Paul Jacobs, was a big Star Trek fan. And he was interested in working with XPRIZE to put out this competition. So that's how the challenge was named after the Tricorder.
All right, wonderful. Well, it really tells us the future is now. So, and it's coming faster than we expected.
Definitely.
So tell us a little bit about your specific role in the project.
So I served as the primary medical consultant advisor for the team. I think I was fortunate enough to have enough knowledge in medicine, engineering, and computer programming that I could work with a number of people that were part of the team. Now this is a big challenge, so it literally takes a village in order to tackle this challenge. So there were at least 50 people in our team. And what I was responsible for in the beginning was actually brainstorming ways to diagnose using this portable device. So, in modern medicine, we rely on CAT scans, blood tests that require a big laboratory, or even for emphysema or COPD, you require a big a pulmonary function test, which sometimes takes up a whole room. So the challenge was to actually think how we could put all that and put it into a small device that weighs less than 5 pounds. An example of that, for instance, emphysema, in order to avoid having to use a big spirometer device, we had to think ways that we could just rely on the cell phone itself. And we thought of a number of things, including how fast someone breathes with activity, how the oxygen changes with activity. We thought about how the sounds, the acoustic properties of the chest. We thought about electrical impedance of the chest in order to see how it moves. And ultimately, we came to the final decision to use the sound of the voice, or the sound of the air coming out of your trachea. And you blow into the device, and that device would actually assess the resonant frequency of the flow that comes through the trachea. And that was the way. But in order to get to that point, you had to brainstorm through things and see what was feasible, and importantly, what was valid to help diagnose emphysema. And I think that was my role for a number of the conditions. The next role that I served was actually to design an artificial intelligence system. And what I mean by that is, in order for the device to act as if it were your doctor, it needs to intelligently come to a decision about what test is best for your condition. And that was a tough thing, because in the beginning we had thought that the challenge would be to just come with a diagnostic set. We knew that the patient had anemia. We would go ahead and administer the test and say yes or no, that was present or not present. But as it turned out, and I think to the credit of XPRIZE, they always had the consumer at mind, and they had us go as if the consumer had no idea whether they had a condition or not, and we had to devise a system that would go through the set of questions in order to figure out what test that you had to do. And so we I devised this artificial intelligence system that simulated the strategy that physicians take in order to diagnose a patient with a medical condition. And that was the challenge that I was involved in as part of this competition.
Wonderful. That's a tremendous accomplishment to be able to create essentially a virtual physician that's guided through your smartphone. So tell us about the project team. Who else is involved?
So there were, as I said, about 50 members of this team. The leader of our team is C.K. Peng. He is a colleague and actually my mentor. And he, in the beginning, it was in 2011 or 2012 when we had this discussion about entering this competition. They had made the announcement, and CK and I were discussing the possibility of entering this competition. At that time, CK was doing a number of projects to portably diagnose conditions such as atrial fibrillation and sleep apnea. So already we had some inroads in this area. Around that time, around 2012, he moved to Taiwan to serve as the Dean of the College of Health and Science and Technology in the National Central University in Taiwan. And there in that position, he was able to communicate with a number of people in Taiwan, including the cell phone company HTC, who provided much of the material and also the device expertise. But he was also able to work with a number of physicians in the Taiwanese hospitals there to create certain disease-specific tests. And this is why the team is largely localized in Taiwan, but it is actually a dual country team, so in Boston as well as in Taiwan.
I understand there were actually 29 competing teams from 9 countries, and as you mentioned, it began in 2011, 2012, so it lasted 4 years. What were the stages of the competition?
Right. In the beginning, actually there were up to 300 teams that submitted a written application in the beginning. So I think that was around 2013. They wrote a written application, and the XPRIZE Foundation weeded down based on the written applications, I think coming down to the 20 or so teams. 29 competing teams. I believe that decision was made around 2014. And then once we knew that we were one of the 29 teams, then we began to work towards creating the device and all the assorted kits and tests that came with it. Actually, we were thinking much about it even before we knew what the results of that written competition was. And then once it actually was from 2014 to 2016 is the time that we had in order to put the paper process, the ideas on paper into actual reality. And that just took 2 years. And it was in 2016 that we had to submit all our devices to enter in a clinical trial. And that clinical trial then subsequently decided the final 7 teams, and then after a set of additional clinical data collection, it was narrowed down to 2. And then after the second one, after they did clinical trial, then they decided the winner.
So it was a very rigorous evaluation, getting both consumer input and then also from a clinical trial perspective to look at efficacy and accuracy.
Correct. And XPRIZE did an excellent job because they At the first stage, the most important thing that they wanted to emphasize was safety. So they had a number of safety tests of our device, and even some of the minor things that you wouldn't even think of. We had, for instance, for our vital signs monitoring, we had a cord that held our vital signs base. And that cord, there was the risk of potentially strangling someone if that cord didn't break off easily. So they had asked our team to create a breakable cord so that when it pulls, it actually would come off. So they do a really good job of instituting safety requirements as the first step. And then they talk about user friendliness. Then they actually did the clinical trial. And then the clinical trial did two things. One was to ask the user, the consumer, how well they enjoyed or not enjoyed the device, and gave their feedback. And then the second point, the second criteria they focused on was the efficacy, as you say, of the device. And it was to see whether we accurately diagnose the conditions of these patients who are in this clinical trial.
So what did you find the most challenging part of developing the tricorder device?
There were a lot of challenges, and as you can imagine, putting a home device that served as well as a panel of doctors and weighing only 5 pounds was a big challenge. And I think the weight was a very big challenge. HTC, which is the company that collaborated with us, had to create a device that weighed less than 5 pounds but had all these components. And even the material, the form factor, it all had to look good, but they had to use materials that weren't too heavy. And that was definitely a big challenge. And as a result of that 5-pound limit, we had to actually eliminate some of the sexier materials that we thought were very cool, including something called the electronic nose, which detects the chemical compounds that come out of your breath. So it would have been ideal for pneumonia or TB, for instance. The other device that we thought would have been very interesting and cool would be a blood test that actually took a drop of your blood and could measure your blood count. Those were sophisticated devices that definitely added more to the weight, and going below 5 pounds was going to be a challenge with that. Ironically, though, with that 5-pound challenge, it was also liberating as well, because you had the opportunity to think outside of the box. And the example of emphysema, you could use data that you collect and figure how you could be really innovative on how you could arrive at the diagnosis of emphysema. So you could talk about your oxygenation as you move. You could talk about your breath movements, your dynamics of your chest expansions. You could think about all these different things, and it forced us to think outside the box. So that was really good, but it also was a big challenge. The other big challenge that we encountered was that this was a highly multidisciplinary endeavor, and it required experts from medicine, also from device manufacturers, material engineering, engineers who, electronic engineers, as well as user-friendly, like consumer psychologists who would need to know, how do you make this device useful? And when you have so many disciplines like that, it's very difficult for us to know what is required or what is feasible from another discipline. So the engineer may say, oh, I have this very cool way of measuring a certain physiological measure. Maybe it could be heart rate, or it could be blood pressure, or it could be something in the blood. But if it has no feasible mechanism from a medical standpoint, then it became meaningless. Or on the flip side, if the clinicians say, oh, we would like to do this, and we would like to diagnose anemia using certain electronic technology, the technologists or the engineers would say, oh, that's not possible. We don't have that kind of technology yet. So it became really difficult for us to identify where the limits were in the other disciplines, or even what the possibilities were. And that is where we had a lot of challenges. But I think, going through this project, it helps us to learn each other's discipline. And I think this is going to be an important thing moving forward, is being able to work in a team with multiple disciplines to create new devices.
Yes. Well, and it was clearly a team effort. I mean, and it's a team award and a team prize, and truly recognizes that multidisciplinary approach. And I think as we think about medicine going forward, it sounds like what the Tricorder XPRIZE has done is really been a catalyst to bring together this multidisciplinary conversation and project problem solving in a very new way. So tell me, so what's next for the Tricorder device and for your team?
I think, to the credit of the Tricorder competition, if it weren't for this competition, CK and I would be still focusing on atrial fibrillation, sleep apnea, maybe taking a look at the mathematical analysis of heart rate. But with this competition, it forced us to look at a whole slew of a number of disease conditions. We would not have thought about entering the diagnostics of anemia or emphysema, but this Tricorder challenge forced us to do that. And now that we're at this stage, our aim is actually probably twofold. The first is to create this a technology that would enable us to diagnose not just 15, but up to 100 medical conditions, and to take this technology to remote areas where they don't have access to care. And that, I think, is our primary focus. We are talking with government agencies in different parts of the world. China is one of the first places because there's a lot of rural areas that don't have access to care. We also have communications with Africa, certain countries in Africa, and there are some channels in India as well. So we don't know where this is going to take us, but we're excited about the opportunity to collaborate with NGOs or governments in order to carry this technology to places where they can actually use it. The second place that we would really like to carry this Tricorder is to change the way medicine is practiced, in the way that medicine now is based on collecting data one point at a time, and relatively infrequently. So, when it comes to blood tests, we don't check that frequently. Or even for vitals, we check that maybe once a day, twice a day at most. This device, what this device enables us to do is actually collect data, continuous data, at quite a granular detail. So you can get heart rate from second to second throughout the day, including other things as well, respiration, temperature, and then that information and that data is integrated with other data that's out there. Environment, like the environmental situation, pollution matter, the mood of the community, etc. And I think that the ability to collect all this data, but also to use it in a meaningful way to change medicine, is our second big challenge. And I think the way that TIAH has really helped me in framing this challenge is that TIAH has focused a lot on the environment, the community. There's a lot of expertise in this area, and we would really like to take this technology with that in mind and using the scholars here in order to advance our project.
Terrific, and thank you. And so TIAH, that's the Institute for Integrative Health here in Baltimore. As you mentioned, we have the scholars in the Fellows program who we support in advancing and researching bold ideas that are truly taking our ideas and practices of health right into the future. And clearly, Andrew, that's exactly what you're doing. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the work that the Institute for Integrative Health has supported you as one of our distinguished fellows, and what that work has meant to you.
First off, I have to say the Institute has been critical for my involvement in the Tricorder competition. The Institute has been very supportive and quite flexible. And as a clinician, if I had to work 100% of my time, I would not have had the time in order to dedicate work on this project. So that in itself was a huge support by the Institute. The project that I work with the Institute is understanding how we can use continuous data from the intensive care unit setting. And we are using this open source, open database called the MIMIC database. It's an ICU database that contains about 30,000 ICU admissions. And there is data on continuous physiological measures, which includes heart rate, by ECG, electrocardiogram. And the project that I work with TIH is to see if I can use mathematical algorithms using complexity science or nonlinear dynamics in order to see whether we could use that continuous data to predict prognosis. And the idea being that if you have a reduction in the complexity of your heart rate, that might portend a poorer prognosis. So the project that I'm focusing here at the Institute is to see if that is true or not.
And if you are able to achieve that, how would that advance the next generation of diagnostics?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the data that we're working with, the ICU database, is very noisy. It's a real-world clinical data set. And oftentimes when you do a really rigorous clinical trial, it's under very controlled settings. So you have either, the subjects or the patients who are part of a trial, you have investigators making sure that the data that they get is good and clean. But the data we get from the ICU database is from the real world, and it's actually very dirty and very noisy. And you have, in some cases, people who don't have the leads on. Sometimes you have a lot of movement around. And the first challenge that I had to deal with as part of this project was to deal with that noise. And it was an important challenge because it is an important thing that we are going to encounter when we have devices at home. And when we deal with this noise, and I've worked with a number of people in our lab to create some denoising algorithms, which is actually done pretty well compared to the standard algorithms. And I was able to publish a paper in Physiological Measurements with the Institute's help. But that in itself was an important part as this project, to deal with real-world dirty or noisy data. And then the next point was to see how, with this data set, how the computational mathematical analysis of that would inform what we do from a clinical standpoint. In this case, it was ICU, but we're hoping that some of the lessons that we obtained from this project can be extended to the outpatient setting or for at home as well.
Well, and I think, you make a very important point, because you're talking about the dirtiness, of the signal, the complexity of the signal, and isn't what's really being reflected there is real life, because you compared the simplicity of a controlled clinical trial versus real life. So it sounds to me that the work that you are doing and that you are advancing is to create a way to be able to analyze real world data that is happening with real people, and then be able to create a diagnostic that is looking for anomalies within that information, to be able to help that individual.
Right. And what is included in the real world is not only just the noisiness or the dirtiness, is also the multimodal or the multiple ways in which you can get or obtain data. For heart rate, for instance, you don't have to rely just on the EKG. You could also rely on your blood pressure, or for instance, you could use a plethysmography to measure the pulses in your hand. That in itself can obtain heart rate. You could, in people at home, they won't necessarily be wearing EKGs. They may be wearing an Apple Watch or a smartwatch, which can collect information from that. So when we're dealing with real-world data, we're also dealing with a multitude of sources of data, and to figure out how you could integrate that, work with it, and then get accurate data that you could work with is going to be a big challenge for us.
If you could sum up briefly, how do you believe that this work will ultimately benefit patients?
I think it will benefit probably in two major ways. The first major way is to improve access. Access in the way that there are people who are in remote areas and regions in the world who don't have access to medical care, but to have a device that can serve as your doctor in terms of diagnostics is one step forward towards improving access for these people. And that's not just in remote regions, but it could also be in areas where people don't have the resources, financial resources, or even the time to go see their doctor. So it improves access. The aim is to improve access spatially as well as temporally, time and space. The second thing that I think we would like to, I think this tricorder or this type of technology would advance the care of patients, ideally would be to reduce costs. And we are now at the stage where technologically we can get much more data. And our hope is that a lot of this data will enable us to catch things before it gets too late. And for instance, some of the algorithms that we've developed has been pretty good at determining beforehand whether you're going to get an arrhythmia or whether you're going to decompensate from a cardiac standpoint. So to be able to catch things before it becomes too late or too costly. And the other thing is that ideally we would like to have patients utilize their home or the devices more than they have to use the emergency room or the hospitals. And we are at a very interesting convergence of factors where we have the technology, but we also probably have the political and economic motives to make things cheaper. As we know, the cost of healthcare is practically unsustainable. It's about 18 to 20% of our GDP. And we hear in the news all the time about how certain policies are not addressing healthcare efficiently or adequately. It is a big point, a big conversation amongst all of us in the healthcare field. And if we could find ways that can rely on these portable technologies that are affordable and cheap, maybe we could make some, we can address the healthcare costs.
Well, I believe, I really want to congratulate you and your team on the wonderful award of the Qualcomm Tricorder XPRIZE. It sounds to me just as exactly what you said, is that this device aims to create more affordable care, accessible care that will ultimately improve the health of just individuals outside of the doctor's office. So thank you and congratulations again, Andrew.
Well, thank you so much.
Terrific.